All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Nancy Contreras, and I am the Financial Literacy Specialist / Advisor for TRIO here at Metropolitan Community College. Welcome to the third event that MCC is holding in honor of Hispanic Latino Heritage Month 2024. Today, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Delia Fernández-Jones. Dr. Fernandez-Jones is the Associate Dean for Equity, Justice, and Faculty Affairs in the College of Arts and Letters, Associate Professor of History, core faculty member of Chicano, Latino Studies, and the outgoing chair of the Women of Color Initiatives at Michigan State University. Engaging the transformative justice framework, her position on the Dean Senior Leadership Team centers on creating and sustaining equitable relationships and policies within the college. Dr. Fernandez-Jones works to help the college deepen its investments in the Culture of Care initiative and make accessible the charting pathways to intellectual leadership models. As a historian and scholar of Latinx studies, Dr. Fernandez-Jones has drawn on her lived experiences as a Latina in Michigan, an extensive primary source of research to document and theorize Latinx placemaking in the Midwest. She is the author of the award-winning book, Making the Mexican City, Mexican and Puerto Rican Migration, Activism, and Placemaking in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her book detailed how disparate Latinx communities came together to respond to local, racial, and economic challenges and simultaneously transformed Grand Rapids and the Midwest from the 1920s to the 1970s. Dr. Fernandez-Jones will speak to us today on the topic of placemaking as belonging, Latinx history, and the greater Midwest. Through her personal and professional journey as a first-generation Latina college graduate to her professional journey, as a first-generation Latinx college graduate to later becoming professor of Latinx history and Latinx studies and an administrator. Dr. Fernandez-Jones will present on how history can help us to better understand how we make places for ourselves and claim belonging in spaces where we are not always welcomed. She will also discuss how Latinxs and other marginalized groups shape ideas on who belongs in the greater Midwest. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Delia Fernandez-Jones.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you to Sarah and to Noah and to the two professors. I think I heard Professor Valentine, maybe? Yes. And Berba. Thank you both for bringing your classes here. Thank you to students for coming here and sharing this space with me and to folks online. This is my first time in Nebraska, so my first time in Omaha too. So this is a really cool welcome and I really appreciate it. I was listening to my bio and I was like, I got too many jobs. I need to get rid of some of these jobs. I think the thing at my university, like you have to have at least 2, but I feel like I have a little bit more than that and I need to get rid of some of that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these jobs that I have because it is apparently for a reason, right? That I've decided at different points in my life that, you know, I really would like to make spaces a little bit more inclusive and making places where I could belong for myself and for others. And so I do, because I have these 4 jobs, do this in kind of 4 different but interrelated ways. And so as a scholar, one of the things that I do is I'm trying to make space for Latinos, Latinx, Latinxs in Michigan and the Midwest, right? I'll talk a little bit more about this, but I think there is this idea that the Midwest, the greater Midwest, I think is what we would call it when we connect Michigan and Nebraska, is like America's heartland. And that has a really specific connotation, right? It's giving like farms and honestly, white folks and only white folks. When in fact, we know, because we live here and we talk with other people, that lots of people live here and lots of people have called the greater Midwest home for generations. And so I'm trying to work on how can we reimagine this narrative of the Midwest to be more inclusive. The other things that I'm trying to do is I work in Latinx studies. I don't know if we have Latinx studies at this space, but you might be taking classes that draw from Latinx studies methodologies. And so Latinx studies is the study of Latinos, of the people, of their history, of the condition that they live in. And so it draws from sociology, it draws from history, it draws from art and from literature, and this way of theorizing Latino experiences that we often would not get if we looked at them from other angles. If we looked at just from the kind of ways that history trains us, or sociology trains us, we wouldn't necessarily see all of these things about Latinos. So thinking about how to use Latinos' personal experiences, their lived experiences, to create theories and to understand their experiences. This is on the tradition of Black studies, of women's studies, Native American Indigenous studies. So I'm trying to also work on making that way of thinking, these things that we learn from people, from their communities, and bringing that into academia, because oftentimes that's kind of left out of it. The other thing I do is the Women of Color Initiative. So this was started by some friends, some predecessors in early 2016. But the idea is that women of color are often the most marginalized on large campuses. And so what if we rethought our relationship to the university, and that we kind of changed the ways we work with women of color to make it so that we could center on their experiences, and creating ways to help the most marginalized could actually help everybody. And so I do that, I help to lead that through different arts initiatives, through a lot of what I call demystifying college, demystifying graduate school, demystifying academia or higher education. And then for the College of Arts and Letters, I'm really invested in trying to make sure that in my role, I work with faculty in particular, as well as thinking about equity and justice for the college. So one of the things that's really important to me is understanding that not all faculty have the same background. For a long time, faculty in higher education were coming from like the very rich upper class society. And in fact, that's not what the profile of academics looks like anymore. We have people from these other places, but the systems we've created for faculty are based on like really rich, really exclusive ways of doing things. So how can we recreate the systems to actually include people who have the least amount of resources that in fact help everybody? Has anybody been asked this question before? You don't have to raise your hand, which is the reflection, right? I think this is really where most of my desire to be involved in these types of initiatives has come from, because as a Latina who's born and raised in Grand Rapids and West Michigan, I would often get, okay, but where are you really from? And I'm like, I'm really from Grand Rapids. Okay, but yeah, but like, where are you really from? Like, I don't know what to tell you. My parents were born in Grand Rapids. My grandmother was born in Michigan. Like, I'm from Grand Rapids. And I was trying, growing up hearing this, it's kind of thinking to myself, like, okay, there's something about me that's making it that other people don't think I belong here. And then coming to terms with, okay, it's what I look like, it's what my name sounds like, it's all of these different things. And thinking about, okay, how can we make it? I want to make it so that people stop asking me this question, right? I want to make it so that people don't think this is a question that you maybe should ask, right? That there might be other ways, if you're really curious, there might be other ways to learn that doesn't necessarily put the onus on the person to explain their whole being and their whole reason for existing. And so a lot of these, my approach to all of these different jobs that I have, right, comes from Black feminist theory and women of color theory, right? And so I've learned, right, in my journey as a scholar, I went to school for a really long time. I went to school for like 10 years. And if you haven't figured it out already, I'm a full-blown nerd. Like, I love this stuff, right? I love this stuff. And so Black feminism is one of the places that I draw inspiration from. And it's because like in the 1970s, if you remember like the Black Power movements, the Chicano movement, this is after Martin Luther King has been assassinated. We're having this kind of crisis of how do we move forward, and Black Power emerges as this way of saying, you know what? It's okay to be Black. And in fact, you should be proud. You can be proud to be who you are after decades, centuries, right, of telling people that they were inferior because of what they look like. And so in this time period in the 1970s, Black women in particular were trying to figure out a space for themselves within the Black Power movement, because a lot of it was male driven, right? The same thing for Chicanos, the same thing movements for white women were also figuring out like, men are not making spaces for us like they should. So they started to make their own spaces. And the Combahee River Collective was one of these spaces that Black women had made. And they had started to write down their ideas on like, in fact, if there is Black power that's kind of a male-dominated movement and is not thinking about us, we need to say what we need, because there's a lot of needs that we have that they're not taking into account as women, as mothers, as just as other parts of society. And so one of the things that they said in their statement was that if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression, right? Because one of the things that they're pointing out is that Black women, and then also women of color, but Black women in particular, are some of the most marginalized people. And then you layer on other identities, right? If you're laying on class, if you're laying on ability, all of these other things make it so actually, yeah, there's a group of people who have the least amount of power. So if we can fix it for the group that has the least amount of power, that would then make it so that everybody has access to resources and the things that they need. And so I take my cue right from there and thinking about when I'm trying to approach, like, how am I gonna make this better for my faculty? How am I gonna make it so that Latinos are not this marginalized group and other people of color aren't this marginalized group in my university? I'm thinking about, okay, how do we think about it for the people who are most affected, right? Who have the least amount of power. And so what I'm doing essentially is creating belonging, right? Trying to create belonging in places that were not constructed for these particular groups. And so I'm defining belonging as knowing that you're welcome, right? So what are ways that you know that you're welcome? And first, I think about there's no challenges to your presence in a space or a role where people aren't, because this question kept happening for me in other instances, like, you're the professor? Yeah, I'm the professor, right? There's this doubt that I could be the professor, right? So nobody's challenging that I'm supposed to be in there. And that you're seeing yourself and people like you reflected in the leadership and the policies of a place that you're at, whether it's your job, whether it's institutions that you go to, museums, if it's this college or other places, you're seeing yourself reflected, that there are buy-in from your community in the roles, right, that make decisions. And that you have support for your unique challenges and people like you face. And so I say this with the caveat too, that it's one thing, right, to think that one of the things that we know about society is that race is real in terms of the impact, right? So we know race is kind of constructed, it's this thing that we made, but the impact of race is real. So we know that people who look like us, who share similar physical descriptions like us, have similar experiences. But I want to caution, right, that this saying that I was taught by some of the Black professors that I had in graduate school and undergrad, that not all skin folk are kinfolk. And what that means is that just because somebody looks like you doesn't mean they share your values and thinks like you. And in fact, you might find allyship and support in places from people that don't look like you, right? And so we're being open to where our allies are. We're being open to finding them in places and people you might not think of, and also being a little cautious, right? To make sure that the people that you're allying yourself with are sharing that same values and wanting to do this work. So one of the things that I think of, like, what's a tangible example of how we can create a place that people know that they're welcome, that there's support for specific challenges. And I saw this story about a library in Virginia, right, that was able to create little pods for parents or for people who are caretaking, right, that have babies with them. So if you're thinking about who might need the resources at the library a lot, parents are one group, right? That they might have, if they don't have access to internet or to the resources that the library has otherwise, you need to be there. And bringing your own child with you is also part of that, right? If you have the least amount of resources, you're probably not having, access to reliable care for your child unless they're with you. And so this is a way to say, parents, you can come here and you can bring your kids. You are welcome here. You belong at the library. That in fact, children belong at the library too, and as well. And I also think about another example might be something in my job at the university. I don't know if you guys know this, but a lot of times at universities, if you have to travel or do something for work, you have to pay for it out of your own pocket and then you get reimbursed for it. Which feels like a setup, right? I'm here because I need money. I'm working because I need money, right? That I have to pay money and then you pay it to me back. That could cause a lot of problems. But if you built that system based on elite people who were already rich to begin with, then it's nothing for them to pay out of pocket and get reimbursed, right? But for a lot of first-gen folks, a lot of people who come from backgrounds, working class backgrounds, if I pay you that, if I have to pay that money, that means something else is not getting paid. And so my college has decided we're not gonna run our reimbursement culture anymore. As much as we can, we will pay for things upfront for faculty members so that they do not have to incur, like, because then you have to put on a credit card and then the month passes, then the interest gets added. Now all of a sudden you got into debt for your job, right? This is something that is a way that we can create an example of creating a different policy that was meant for somebody, changing that policy to create it that helps everybody, right? There's no harm to the rich folks. They can do it however they want, right? And there's still no harm, but we do then reduce the harm for the people who have the least. So there are some tangible examples of the kinds of things that I'm trying to, the policy implementation I'm trying to do. And so my hope is that we can belonging then is transformative. If we're centering belonging in our policies and the ways that we're thinking about how to change things, this is transformative. So we can reshape the narrative of who belongs. It's not this exclusive narrative of the Midwest that there's only certain people who belong here and the rest of us are just perpetually new, right? Even if our families have been here for generations. This is also a vote of confidence in marginalized peoples and their futures. If we ready ourselves in our institutions, in our classrooms for the least, for those who have the least and the most marginalized, then we are saying to folks, you will belong here in the future too. You will continue to belong here. And then this also signals a cultural shift for those who hold resources and exclude them from others. So if we're making this decision that, you know what? For example, we're not gonna engage in reimbursement culture. What we're telling the university above us is that we're making a shift and maybe you all should too, right? And this can alter our relationships with and understanding of one another. So if we're making these policies, if we're making things more accessible to everybody, we then have an opportunity to have more people in the space and learn from them and learn from one another. Whereas if we keep going along this route of exclusivity, we're not gonna have lots of people together, not gonna be able to understand their stories and why their lives are the way they are. And so all of this, right, these projects that I've been working on have kind of stemmed from this one thought that I had of kind of trying to understand my own situation in Michigan. Now, these are historical photos from my family and documents that deal with my family, migration to Michigan and to the Midwest. So I'll tell you about those in a second. But one of the things that, I kept asking myself after people be like, where are you really from? And feeling like, okay, obviously I don't belong in Michigan. And then as kids, we got to visit Puerto Rico and visit Mexico. And I was like, this is amazing, right? Look at this, right? I speak Spanglish at best. So as long as I didn't talk, people didn't question where I was from, right? Once I started talking, they were like, oh, you de afuera, you from out there. You're not really from the island. But for a minute, I could just be there. And nobody was asking me, where are you really from? So then I started thinking about, well, why are we here? Why did we end up in Michigan? Of all the places. And if you have family that have migrated here, you might have asked yourself the same question, like, why did we end up here in this Midwest place? Especially, I don't know, Michigan's got some mean winters. The winters not that bad down here?
Yes.
They're not that bad? Or
No,
they are bad? Okay. All right, so especially in the wintertime, after our experience of a summer in Puerto Rico, I'm like, oh man, I'm here. And so I feel like I've done the pettiest thing ever is that people have asked me these questions. Why are you here? Where are you from? All of these things. I went and wrote a whole book about it. You know what? From now on, if you want to ask me that question, you can read my book. That's how petty that I took this, right? I created a whole career out of like, I'm done with y'all asking me these questions about where I'm really from. And so this set me on a path, and I'll get to kind of my my undergrad and how that went, but I want to start with this. I want to start way back. I want to start back in, at least I want to mention like the late 1800s and then kind of move forward to where I fit into this, this trajectory of migration and placemaking and people making places for themselves. And so part of my research, right, took me on why did we get here? And what I found is that my reason for being in Michigan, like many Latinos who end up in Nebraska, are the same, right? That colonialism, that racial violence, land theft, economic displacement, after the Mexican-American War in the 1848 and the Spanish-American War in 1898 made it so that Mexico and Puerto Rico were destabilized. And so people were looking for ways to make a living and saw out migration as an economic, as an alternative to survival, right? That people in fact lost their land, that US decision makers, US governments had put in policies in Puerto Rico, for example, that made it so that the island was only growing really one crop. And that's kind of a bad move, right? For an island, if you only grow one crop, what happens if something happens to that one crop? What happens if we acquire another place that has that same crop, or other places grow that same crop? Puerto Rico then becomes really disadvantaged. And the same similar things happened in Texas as people lost land while the US took over. And so all of those things set my family and other families on this journey. And so in the 1920s, my grandmother's family were recruited from Texas. They had moved from Mexico to Texas. A Mexican Revolution happened, and so they moved during the revolution. And they were recruited. So this is my great grandmother, Marilda, and my grandmother, Juanita, and her siblings. All of her siblings were born in Saginaw, Michigan, because my family had been recruited to work on the sugar beet fields in Michigan. And I know, and I'll show pictures of this later, that in at least the late 1890s and early 1900s, Mexicans were also recruited for to come to Nebraska to work on those same sugar beet fields, right? So we have this connection, right? We have this agricultural connection across the Midwest. And so my grandmother was born and raised in Saginaw, Michigan. And when she was 15, she met my grandfather, who came in the 1940s. He was not a bracero worker, but there was a bracero program in which the United States recruited Mexican male workers to come from Mexico to help during World War II. So I hope you hear, right? We were recruited. We were asked to come here to do this labor. My grandmother met my grandfather, and she was like, I married him because I thought he was going to take me to Mexico. As a 15-year-old girl in Saginaw, she was like, I'm out of here. There's got to be something better for me. Spoiler alert, he took her to Grand Rapids, right? Not Mexico at all. She still was a little salty about that towards the end of her life. And this right here is the stay of deportation for my grandfather, because my grandfather came here undocumented without papers. At the time when people were recruiting braceros to come, not everybody could qualify to be a bracero, but people knew that there was work here and that they were actively recruiting, so everybody, a lot of folks came. And by some miracle, because he was likely because he was married, he had a job, he had kids, he was able to get his deportation suspended and regularize his status. But I keep it up on my wall. I keep it up on my wall. So I'm like, this is my history, right? This is our history, that these are my peoples came here, right, to do this work that nobody else wanted to do, to provide, to feed the rest of the state, to feed the region. At the same time, in Puerto Rico, as I explained, they're going through a lot of upheaval and turmoil in terms of the economy. People are starving during the Great Depression and before World War II. And my grandfather, his brother, his cousins, his father-in-law, all were recruited to come to Michigan to work on fields alongside Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And so that's a passenger manifest that talks about, or that lists my cousin, or my dad's cousin, as, you know, his home being in Lake Odessa, Michigan, which is near Grand Rapids. And I wanted to show you this map from another scholar, Mark Rodriguez. He wrote this book called Tejano Diaspora that shows where farm workers were going in the 1950s at the beginning of the season and at the end of the season. And one of the things that you can see is they're going everywhere. Right? They're going everywhere. That these policies, if you're thinking of like, man, Mexicans are really all across the United States, it's because of these type of recruitment policies. And so this is the beginning, and there's movement during the second half, but you can see, right, Nebraska's there, the whole greater Midwest. Some places in the South is still largely dependent on Black agricultural labor at the time. So Mexicans are not necessarily as present, but they are in some regions. But you can see, right, the upper Midwest gets a lot of folks there. This was a document that I found on Puerto Ricans and their treatment in Michigan. Does anybody read Spanish? What does it say? or give me the gist.
Describe horrors of camps in Michigan.
Yeah, they describe the horrors of camps in Michigan, right? So the byline says they say that this is slavery under the 20th century, under the American flag that's supposed to be the symbol of liberty. That Puerto Ricans got to Michigan and found out that they were actually going to be charged exorbitant rates for room and board, for food, and then when they would go into the community, were treated very poorly. So many Puerto Ricans left, right? As citizens, without the fear of deportation or the threat of deportation, they left. They went to New York, they went to Cleveland, they went to Chicago, and some went to Detroit and to Grand Rapids. And that's where we trace kind of the movement that ends up in the city that I studied. And I had, because I'm a historian, I had to look to see what was written about Omaha, because I figured, I was like, we share a similar past, right? I know the greater themes. And so this is from Nina Nixon's article on Mexican-American Voluntary Association. So Mexican-American associations that helped Mexicans that date back into the early 1900s. And these are Mexican beat workers on a train listening to a lecture on hoeing and thinning in Spanish for their benefit. These are the same types of lectures that my Puerto Rican and Mexican ancestors were also given. They were also taught very, very much the same kind of look on their face, right? Looking for something that's got to be a little bit better than what they're experiencing. So I went on to think about, okay, what happens to folks once they get to Grand Rapids, once they get to West Michigan, from Texas, from all of these other places, and by the mid-1950s, this is the Cold War, there's a really big push for assimilation, that we can all be American. What that rhetoric doesn't take into account is race and skin color and the ways that we've identified some people as actually not as American as others, right? And so this is Irma Garcia. She was in second grade when she came, and she recounted this in an oral history, that our lunches might have consisted of tortillas with some leftover meat or something, and it'd be rolled up in a butternut bread wrapper. And then you would get to lunch and put the tortilla under the table, because tortillas were not known then. So everybody would look at you like, what are you eating? Right, and so this is, I don't know, butternut bread. That's a national brand. They have butternut bread here, right? They used to, right? Like they had also a distribution place in Grand Rapids. So like it was butternut bread felt very like you belonged with butternut bread, right? But this idea of tortillas, right? That were being different, and the food that she was eating was different, right? Those kind of questions of what are you eating? Where are you from, right? What you're doing doesn't belong here is one of the things that she was feeling. She also went on to remark that she found that other parents wouldn't let their kids play with her because of how dark her skin was. And then she also felt like, I was not Black and I was not white, I was other, and this is really isolating. And in Grand Rapids, a northern urban city, we really had this dichotomy of Black and white, and anybody else who was in the middle was really hard, right, to figure out where they belonged. And Irma was in that category. But I will say for Afro-Puerto Ricans, right, Puerto Ricans who are of African descent, where you can read their Blackness on their body, their face, they face a particular challenge because of the anti-Blackness that was built into Grand Rapids society already. And so they could not live where some other light-skinned Puerto Ricans lived, and they lived among Black folks. But the other part was they didn't speak English. So they couldn't talk with Black folks either while they first came, right? And so they're seeing themselves as like, where do we belong in Grand Rapids if it's not in either of these communities, and we can't be close to our other communities, right? That them present challenges. So what I like to study, it turns out, is that how do people then, faced with all of these structural issues that make it so that they can't feel like they belong, how do they then make places? How do they engage in place making for their own belonging? And so one of the things that I study is kind of religious spaces and recreational spaces. Because those are the two kind of places where these Mexican and Puerto Rican, Tejanos as well, right? These folks were not just laborers. So much of their like idea of themselves and the ways that people thought of them was based on their position as a migrant laborer who had settled in Michigan. And so what happens then so they can feel like not just workers, like actual people? And so the church is one of them, right? Because of the legacies of colonialism, that many Latinos are Catholic. And so the Catholic Church became a place where they went, and in fact, they went and told the diocese, we're here now, we need resources dedicated to us and the well-being of our community. And they created the Mexican Apostolate, which they still call the Mexican Apostolate even after Puerto Ricans got there, because the diocese did not know that Puerto Ricans existed, right? They're like, this must be some other type of Mexican we didn't know was here, right? Unfortunately. And so they create, this is a Christmas at that the Mexican Apostolate put on. This is my aunts and uncle, my tío Sorrelo and Titi Rosi, during their first communion. They had come from Puerto Rico when they were like 11 and 9. And this was one of the first things they did once they got here. But they also created Our Lady of Guadalupe, a chapel that would become the home to Mexicans and Puerto Ricans from like the 1940s into the 1950s. And because, you know, I did my research and I wanted to look up, you know, what were they doing in Nebraska? Nebraska and Omaha also had an Our Lady of Guadalupe that was built in 1919. That they also had Christmas parties in 1925. In 1935, Mexicans were represented at the International Folk Festival. A group of Mexicans danced at the All Nations Festival in 1945. Spanish and Mexican youth clubs also began to form. And that their fundraising created Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. It closed and then it reopened in the 1950s, right? So again, this connection that we have across the Midwest. But these spaces, right? These spaces were one of them that were really important. And I love studying parties. I love studying parties. I grew up at parties like living room parties, right? Living room parties, or sometimes at a dance hall if we could, right? These parties were so important because they're this one place that people can gather where nobody is asking them, where are you from? Why are you here? What are you all doing, right? That they could just be themselves, and they were able to take them to what was actually Italian-owned dance halls. They knew that they were welcome at the Italian-owned dance halls because the Italian-owned dance halls also rented their space to Black folks. And that's how they understood, you know, how to navigate this racial landscape in Grand Rapids. But there's my grandmother back there, one of my cousins, my aunts, dancing in what we call like in the sala. Like you getting dressed up to go sit in the sala. You about to go get dressed up and sit in somebody's living room. I don't know if you ever have to do that, if you've ever had to go to that party, but that's what you're gonna do. You're gonna get your tights on and all the things. This is my Mexican grandmother next to my Puerto Rican great aunts and one of their friends. And so one of the things that I argue in the book, right, is that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans are not the same, in fact. But in Grand Rapids, they start to learn more about each other and create a community where Mexicans and Puerto Ricans are welcome. And because the other thing that would happen to me is people would be like, oh, you're Mexican? That's what we call ourselves. How did that happen? Because people think that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans don't get along. And I'm like, how did that happen? I'm like, well, I don't know, you should ask my mom and dad. Okay, that's what seems very personal. But that was the thing that I knew was the fact that I wasn't the first generation of Mexican, that I had a great aunt and uncle who met on the field, and I had whole cousins, my dad's cousins were Mexican, and this was also this evidence. I was like, see, my Mexican grandma was my Puerto Rican aunt before my parents even married, right? That these were families that they were part of a community together. And I also love I love festivals, because festivals are this way of temporarily saying, oh, I belong here, right? Like and when these communities are new, they don't have, or not even new, but when these communities are evolving and don't necessarily have the resources to buy their own spaces, festivals and parades become this moment, this weekend, where like this weekend for the Latino festival, for the Mexican festival, we take over downtown. This place that has been largely decided was not for us, we get to be it, and we get to claim belonging. We have this big statue, abstract art piece, it's a piece by Andrew Calder that kind of defines the city. We put it on our logo, we put it on the flag, we put it everywhere. And so I love this picture because here's like, it's a queen of the festival contest. So young Latinas, right, dressed up, mariachis, standing in front of the symbol of the city, right? Of being like, oh, we too, we belong here too. This is also a Calder classic that belongs to us. And I love this one of these Mexican men riding down downtown Grand Rapids that's like really, these are like all the official buildings, right? Like the city hall, the county seat is there, all of that. And they have their American, Mexican, and Michigan flag, right? This is a way of asserting, I belong.
we belong here. We all belong here. Even if it's temporarily, we get to take over this, we belong here all the time. I also study activism as a way of making places for one another. Because the other part of this, it's not just this like, where are you from? It's that the city did not have anybody who spoke Spanish on their in their employ until the late 1970s or mid 1970s. And there have been people living here since the 1920s. So this means that Spanish speaking people could not actually access the resources that the city has. And what I mean is like there's unemployment, but there's also like trash services. Right? There's less, the light is out in your neighborhood. How are you supposed to contact somebody? Who are you supposed to talk to if they don't have anybody who's willing to translate? And so oftentimes this community helped itself, right? The city was not creating a social safety net for them, so they created their own. And they started identifying volunteers, like who speaks English and who speaks Spanish, who's bilingual. Okay, if you have an appointment, please go ask Carmen. Carmen will take you to your appointment. Just make sure you guys will go together. And they started doing that eventually until they created the Latin American Council for West Michigan. And so this was like a social service hub where they started their own unemployment. They started their own well baby checkups. They started English classes. But the other thing that they did that I think was really amazing was they started more cultural awareness. Because to be in Grand Rapids meant you had to distance yourself from that identity. Like little Irma was like, I'm hiding my tortillas, I can't really be myself. It's also the 1970s, right? So Black power is happening, the Chicano movement's happening. It's okay to be brown, it's okay to be Black. They created libraries. They started putting on programming. They had a youth group that met in the basement of this building. They got pool tables, they got cooking classes, they got hair classes, all of these things to embrace, right, who people were and their culture. And it's actually at this point that my parents were teenagers in this time period where they met. And so I have reaped the benefits of this project because my parents did not grow up ashamed of who they were. My parents grew up very proud to be Mexican and Puerto Rican, so much so that I grew up to be very proud of being Mexican. I knew I was Mexican before I knew I was American. Because that didn't make it, like American didn't make any sense for us in our context, right? We weren't thinking like that. But people were always, I knew as a little kid, when somebody asked me what my nationality was as a 7-year-old, right? I was like, I don't know, but I'm Mexican, right? That's what I do know. So all of these places, right, all of these actions created places for Latinos. I also studied the way that the city discriminated against Latinos and Black folks. If you read that, you'll see you'll get the kind of environment they were in. City job policy found not fully unbiased. That's a double negative, right? So what are you really trying to say? City job policy found unbiased. Right, is it that they weren't really willing to say, they weren't willing to go that far, like totally unbiased, just a little bit biased, right, is what they were going for. That's such reluctance to admit it. And in fact, a coalition of Black and Latino folks and white allies came together to sue the city for employment in the city, in particular for firefighters, where there were no firefighters who were Latino, there were no policemen who were Latino, there were very few Black folks who were in those. And then any other position that the city that Latino and Black folks occupied were janitorial, right? So they sued the city. And this is also not just related to Grand Rapids. Lots of places, this was a tactic in the 1970s to sue the city and base it off of the civil service test that you had to get in and say the tests don't actually apply to the job. And they won, as many folks did. It doesn't solve the problem by any means, the kind of structural problem, but it does make that Mexican, Puerto Rican, Black folks do start to get into some of those jobs. And so I grew up hearing about those stories from my parents who remembered, like this was the point of pride when Pablo Martinez sued the city and won. That was it. So I am, where's my dad? That's my dad. That's my dad with all of his cousins, his Puerto Rican cousins. That's my mom and her sister with their Puerto Rican neighbors who happen to be my dad's cousins because it's a Grand Rapids thing. That's how people live. I don't know if there's a thing like that in Omaha where everybody knows everybody, but that's kind of how it works in Grand Rapids. So I have the benefit, right? I read these like second generation of benefits of these folks. And so how much time do I have? We're ended at,
11. Yeah.
okay, I'm just gonna show you some pictures.
You can go a little
I
longer.
was
if you
like,
like
I
it.
wanna do a question. You guys have questions?
Yes.
Okay, good, because if not, I was gonna ask you some. All right, so I'm just gonna say, my parents ended up being teen parents, right? This is their senior year. There's a senior year. By 19, they had 2 kids. And me when they were 26, I can't even imagine, right? Having they had 4 kids by 29. I have 1 and I am 37. Like, oh, it's a lot of work. But somehow my parents, right, did this. And I think about my parents and this idea of belonging because I think we benefited from these other systems that we've created, this Latino community has created to create belonging and to kind of wedge open some of these things that weren't accessible. So I do think of my parents as for a long time, the last generation who didn't need a college degree to make an ample living for themselves. And part of it for us was because my dad got hired at GE Cable in 1980 because his brother got hired because his friend got hired. Right? That was the only way we're getting into these jobs. My dad worked there for 43 years. He just retired in December. And so we had that, they've been married for 43 years, got married, all these things happened for them in 1980. But we were able to have a mostly stable upbringing because my dad had access to that job. Whereas so many other Latino Black folks did not have that compared to my own family, like my own cousins didn't have the same types of privileges. So I think about my family as these larger support systems. My dad is one of 10, my mom is one of 7. We got family on family on family there. We also benefited from, there was a Catholic school that had a sliding scale, right? So think about how do you reach the most marginalized, right? You make it so that the price to go there is darn near free, right? And you supplement through all these things. This school it lasted 100-something years, but it's not there anymore. But we were able to get this education because neither one of my grandparents had finished grade school, right? And so they knew that the idea was like, education was supposed to deliver us. So my parents were like on it. They didn't have a chance to go to college. I did find out later that my mom had a chance to go to the community college. She got a scholarship, but to her and the gender norms at the time, she couldn't be both a student and a mother, which now we know, right? People are doing it left and right and it's okay. But to her and the gender norms really, right? That she had to be a mother at that time. And so they were like, all right, well, you guys got to go to college. Also, we didn't know how, right? We didn't know how. We're making this up. I feel bad for my older sister. She was our test run. I wanted to show you pictures of when I was also a community college student briefly. And to be like, I was cool, okay? But it's not giving cool right now, but thank you. It's like, and we were doing those baby hairs before everybody, all of those things, but I was cool. It kind of lost, right? Kind of lost. I was a really good student in high school, but I ended up going to a high school where people didn't see me as a good student. Like I had 4.0s, honor rolls, but when it came time to honors classes or college visits, they were like, I don't know, you can go if you want to. And like, hey, I'm thinking about, my dad said I should go to college. And you're like, there's the community college application, which is not to say, right, the community college has done wonderful things for all of us, my whole family, right? But I think I could have gone to a 4-year college and I ended up doing it. Because my dad was like, well, your sister went to Grand Valley, a local college that we have. Why don't you just apply? I was like, great. How are we going to pay for it? And I was like, oh my God, do we have money for college? I didn't know about it. No, we do not. He was like, you're gonna get a scholarship. I was like, I am? He was right, I did get a scholarship. At the time, we had a really comprehensive program, right? Thinking about getting to the least, right? For students of color, for a certain GPA and other academic achievements, you could get a full ride. The voters voted that out in 2008, but me and my sister were able to take advantage of that and be able to go to college. I went to Grand Valley State University. I spent a lot of time making space there too. I joined the Latino Student Union, just trying to, make this Midwest State University a little bit more welcoming and inclusive. But again, I was also a really good student. Dean's List, I told you guys I was a nerd. I admitted that early on, right? I was Dean's Listing, all this, still kind of flying under the radar. And it wasn't until I met David Stark, a professor, he's Puerto Rican and Cuban. He noticed that I was doing really well in his history classes. So I was going to be a K through or 6 through 12 social studies teacher. That was the plan.
I was also gonna marry my high school boyfriend because everybody in Grand Rapids marries their high school boyfriend. I told you my parents, they've been together since high school. That's just how we do. Another spoiler alert, did not work out. Did not work out. And David Stark knew it wasn't gonna work out, and he was trying to help me see it, that I couldn't see it. I was like, I love him. But we were on two very different pathways. But David Stark was like, I think you could go to graduate school. And I was like, I don't have any money to go to graduate school. I barely had any money to go here. He told me that, in fact, if you do a PhD at one of these bigger schools, they'll pay you to go. They will cover, they'll give you a stipend even. You won't make a lot of money, but you'll make enough to live off of. And he was right. But I definitely went home and told my family, and we all laughed. Like, that man does not know what he's talking about. Nobody pays you to go to school. You pay them to go to school. That's how it works. He was right, it turns out. So these tiny moments of intervention were happening. And David Stark was one of them. Also, Dolly Lutz, because I was a part of the McNair Scholars Program, which is a TRIO program. Anybody else in TRIO? Yes. Okay. Yes, TRIO, federally funded program. I was in the one that helped students prepare for graduate school. Dolly Lutz was our program advisor, director, who was helping me think about a life that I could have outside of my hometown. Because I really wasn't ready. Nobody had ever left Grand Rapids. Everybody married their boyfriend, all these things, and they were getting ready to tell me, you gotta go away. And I was really, really, really nervous, was very reluctant, but many of the skills that you taught me helped to make that happen. And so there's me and Dolly, it's not a great picture, signing my book for her. So I can't even think, 15 years after I was in my McNair program, I became a 10-year professor, which was the goal of that TRIO program. It means I can keep my job at the university, and I've written a book when I didn't think any of that was possible. That was okay. Graduate school, I did some things, kept trying to make places for women of color in graduate school. Still trying to make places for women of color. This is our annual writing retreat that I put on for graduate students and early career faculty and artists that we brought in, a woman of color artist, a Black woman artist. We believe that the arts are so important. They're the things that remind us that we're humans in a place and time when people want to, remind us that we should be laborers. I spent also a lot of my time trying to make this history more accessible because I wrote this 205-page book. I'm so proud of it. And then my family was like, do you have an audiobook? Is there a Cliff Notes? Where is the shorter version of this? So I'm like, oh, I gotta make something that people will actually be able to access. And so I'm working on historical markers. I heard Omaha has a Latino museum. I'm like, yeah, I like that. We can go in that direction. I spent a lot of there. And so I'm gonna leave you with M. Jackie Alexander. She is a woman of color theorist. And so I keep saying this word, women of color, but you should know, right, that this is people from various different backgrounds who are identifying as one group together. But she says, we are not born women of color, we become women of color. In order to become women of color, we would need to become fluent in each other's histories, to resist and unlearn and impulse to claim first oppression, most devastating oppression, one-of-a-kind oppression, defying comparison oppression. We would have to unlearn an impulse that allows mythologies about each other to replace knowing about one another. We would need to cultivate a way of knowing in which we direct our social, cultural, psychic, and spiritually marked attention on each other. We cannot afford to cease yearning for each other's company. And so what I think about that is, even though she's talking about women of color, this applies to all of us in our relationship to one another. That we are all told narratives about one another. We are popular narratives from media, from histories, from all of these things that tell us that we are all right hurting. We've all been oppressed in different ways. All of those things. And so what the point is, we need to really learn about each other. We need to be in each other's company. We need to share space. We need to unlearn things. We need to be thirsty for the truth and histories that are told by people who are most directly affected by them. And so what I hope you can see is that this women of color feminism, Black feminism, Latino studies, history, all of these things kind of coalesce to give us a model for how to relate to one another, to create belonging in places that we were not created for us. So I'll end right there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fernandez-Jones, for your insight and knowledge on this topic. I believe that there might be some of us who have questions, so I'm gonna open the floor up to the audience. Yes,
This was amazing.
thank you.
Thank you for being here. Are you a member of Sigma Lambda Gamma?
No, but I'm a member of Sigma and the so.
Okay. And then,
Señoritas Latinas Unidas, but I know SLG.
yes,
My sister is actually.
okay, okay. I just saw some people and somebody sent me a
Yeah.
text in your presentation. This was inspiring, amazing. Oh, do you know he's Alexander?
No, but should I?
Yeah, he went to Grand
Grand Valley? Okay.
Yeah, and he, Trio alum.
A Triola too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all, just kudos, it was very, and your energy is amazing.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming. Other questions or comments? Yes.
So, what can students do to ensure that there is a place for them on campuses? And this is more so in light of all of the more recent attacks on ODI
Yes.
across the US, and departments that support students with otherized identities in higher learning.
Yes, I'm gonna start with the second and I'll go back.
Okay.
I think as administrators, I think I've actually had some other things here for administrators. And those in charge of resources, which we also call administrators, right? I think, one of the things that I'm doing and trying to stick within my office is that there are so many attacks on this, just the whole idea, but in particular the name, right? They've changed DEI to mean things that it doesn't. One of the things that I'm really interested in is making sure that we don't preemptively move. Right? There are some states in which you cannot say these words, in which you cannot act. But if your state is not one of them, do not move. Do not move early. You wait until that challenge comes. You wait until that's there. You stand by, like, we need to stand by these principles that I have some colleagues who are like, we're just gonna change our name to like the Office of Access. Which I'm like, that's also great, but these words were not meaningless before, right? That diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging were actually parts of theoretical frameworks of how we transform a space. And so if you're in a space as an administrator, if you have that power, I would not move on that until you have to, until the state says you gotta change. I mean, I don't think there's any harm in plotting and thinking about it, but I also am of the mind of like, I'm not wasting my time on that. Because if all we're gonna do, right, is we're gonna take the name and we're gonna make us call it something else, we already have been thinking about how to make things more inclusive to begin with. So we're prepared for whatever the language shift has to be. But I think there's a stance that we're also taking as administrators and saying like, this is what we do, that this is not something that can be watered down and we won't preemptively water it down. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking about. But for students, I think it's really important to find your community. And whatever that community is, like if it's a community based on gaming, if it's a community based on an identity or an affinity or something like that, like it's really important to not get isolated. I mean, we just came mostly out of a pandemic, right, where the isolation was all of this. And I think about for student well-being, being in community with one another that's the best part of this whole thing, right? The best part of going to college, of taking classes. I mean, the learning is there and I hope you love it. I understand not everybody is as nerdy as I am, but the being with one another, that's the part that's where you start to grow, exposing yourself to other folks. And I think you can do that in these community settings that allow for like this safe entryway into doing that, right? So I would say, you know, to continually seek out one another. And to your administrators work so hard to put on amazing things for you all. Go to those things, go to those things. Me and Sarah were just talking like, I used to offer pizza and people would come, but post-pandemic, they're like, pizza, that's all you got? Like people are not coming out the house for pizza anymore. Like, what you want, tropical smoothie? I can tropical smoothie if you want it. Come out of the house. They're, if you're like, maybe I should go, or maybe I should stay home, go. Just go. Put yourself out there a little bit, because the thing is that there are so many people on this campus who have resources. So many resources. You know, Nancy's job is financial literacy. Nancy got skills that I need, right? And so we need, like, get out there, talk to Nancy, what's your name? Yeah.
James.
James, and you're in ODI?
No, I'm not. So I work, with the Veterans Upper Bound program. It's a TRIO program.
Another, right?
Yeah.
Like, get out there. James got resources, Nancy, Sarah got resources. That's what this is. We're here to serve you. Come get these resources that we got. Your professors, fountain of resources right there, right? Fountains of resources. So take advantage of it. I know post-pandemic, the instinct is to retreat and to not say anything, but I promise life gets better when you are connecting more with folks. Other questions? Because I'll ask them one.
Yeah, go for it, please.
Okay. All right, we have, I know it's a sociology class who's here. And what's the other, are they both sociology?
Human relations.
Human relations. Awesome. This topic of belonging, does it resonate with any of the things that you've been learning about thus far? Does it make sense with some of the things? I'll take head nods. Okay, that was a very good response. Okay, it makes sense. It makes sense. Is there a place on campus or in Omaha that you're like, I belong here, and I know I belong here? And would somebody like to say the place out loud? Your house. Very direct connection to belonging in one's house. Yes, yes. Any other spaces that maybe are a little bit outside your house?
Libraries.
Libraries, yes, always, always.
Coffee shop.
Coffee shops. I know, I used to tell people I work at a coffee shop, but what I made was I was writing at a coffee shop. Oh, no, I'm just there for that.
We have someone say church too.
Church, yes, that these places, right, these are these social places that we design and that we get to shape.
My word.
Work, that's exciting.
Cultural events, stuff like this.
Oh, yeah.
Outside of the metro that promotes culture and awareness.
Yeah, cultural institutions, they're so important. I think, you know, we think of them as added value, but they're not added value, right? They are integral,
Yeah,
right, to our belonging, to our survival.
and then they're also very informative, and it's also a great way to go network too.
Yes, that's dropping some gems, right? Looking to get to know folks. Oh, thank you.
Dr. Fernandez-Jones, where do you see students on your campus connecting?
Our campus is so big. We have 50,000 undergrads. I feel so bad for my students. I'm like, I would have never made it. I would have never made it at Michigan State. At Grand Valley, when I went there, we had 10,000 students, and that was still a lot. So I feel like our students have to work really, really hard to connect with each other. Like the isolation factor, that's where I'm coming from, right? Because our students will stay in the house. They'll be like, you can order DoorDash now, you ain't gotta go to the dining hall if you don't want to, right? So I think students are, you know, with 50,000, we have also like hundreds of student organizations. And so lots of student organizations on literally anything that you can think of. Some of the ones that I interact with are like the Native and Latino business students, right? Like that's how narrow we get. Because there is like a Latino student union and a Black student union. There's also like Black Girl Fitness is a club, right? And so we are able to kind of, because there's so many, kind of getting really narrow into some of those spaces. So I think that's it. I always worry about big colleges when you don't have a ton of like infrastructure for student fun. Like you have to have a really strong rec center, multicultural center, and student union, because otherwise students can get into a lot of other things, a lot of partying, a lot of those things, which might be a part of this particular, you know, developmental stage, but I also want them to have other alternatives. So that's one thing that we're getting a new multicultural center, we're getting a new rec center. And so I'm hoping those will also be spaces where students can find each other and find, you know, alternatives to what our kind of reputation as a big party school.
Sure. All right, audience members, thank you for your participation today, for this discussion and lecture today. We always appreciate your feedback on the online evaluation. So if you have your phone, you can scan the QR code that's on the slide. Otherwise, it will also be emailed out to you.